Have you ever noticed the sound of a notification that didn't arrive? It's not silence, it's absence. An absence that screams. You unlock your phone on reflex, you see nothing. You lock it. You unlock it again. This restlessness, this micro-void that you try to fill with a screen, food, shopping, another trip, another goal, another achievement. This harmless agitation is the most evident symptom of a silent disease, the obsessive search for happiness. You can call it purpose, inner peace, fulfillment. Give it whatever name you want. The game is always the same. The promise that, around the next corner, everything will finally make sense. But that corner never arrives, because it doesn't exist. And that's where the paradox sets in. The harder you try to be happy, the less happy you become. The more you search, the emptier you feel. It's not just you, it's human. It's the myth. Tantalus, in Greek mythology, was condemned to spend eternity thirsty, trapped in a river whose water receded every time he bent down to drink. That is what we do with happiness. We dive into it with thirst, and it withdraws. The multi-billion-dollar self-help industry survives by selling that thirst. Influencers, coaches, opportunistic specialists, they all offer a formula, but the formula is always one more search, and the search is always one more failure. The world is full of people who did everything right and yet feel wrong, because no one told us that happiness is a consequence, not a mission. No one taught us that perhaps it only appears when you stop calling it. This video is about that. About what happens when you finally sit down, look out the window, and realize that what you always searched for was already there. Still harmless, not wanting to be noticed. And it was precisely because of that it was worth it. He is thirsty. He kneels before the crystal clear water, so clear it reflects the sky like a mirror. But when he lowers his head to drink, the river withdraws. The water flees, as if afraid of him. Tantalus tries again. His throat burns, his lips crack, his tongue begs, nothing. And then, hungry, he reaches up to the branch above. Perfect, ripe fruits that shine under the sunday. But the wind picks up and the branches move away, always a millimeter from his touch, always almost. Thus begins one of the cruelest punishments in Greek mythology, not the punishment of suffering, but the punishment of almost reaching what you most desire. Tantalus is the first modern man, the first to live eternally by a thread. The gods punished him for stealing the food of Olympus, but what killed him was not hunger or thirst. It was desire, and since then we live repeating his myth every day. Someone wrote that man is the animal that has not yet come to terms with what it is. That sentence summarizes the modern hell. We live with an appetite that knows no satiety. We want to be better, richer, calmer, more loved, more productive. But every more is a new abyss. You get there, and the ground shifts. You buy the car, and it becomes an old model. You get the body, and it's no longer enough. You find someone, and you already fear losing them. The water, again, recedes. The myth of Tantalus is not a legend about gods. It is an X-ray of the human mind when it believes that happiness is always after. After the job, after the goal, after the when I achieve it. It is the belief that there is a final point where desire finally rests. A point that never arrives, because desire itself lives by not being satisfied. Life is Schopenhauer's pendulum. Pain when we don't have what we want, boredom when we get it. And what do? We look for something new to desire. We return to Tantalus's hell, voluntarily. That is why the world is full of tired people, even surrounded by comforts. That is why we feel guilty for being sad for no reason. Because we were educated to desire endlessly, to transform the present moment into a means, never an end. But there is a way out. It is not the wanting nothing of the gurus or the positive thinking of airport books. It is something simpler and more difficult, to recognize that desire is not the enemy. It is the master you have to learn to disobey. Tantalus was not condemned for desiring, but for believing that desire could be satiated. He believed there was something out there capable of filling what was missing in here. This is the mistake we still make every day, and perhaps happiness is not in satisfying desire, but in stopping serving it. In looking at the water that withdrew, being happy can be the most disguised form of prison. It is an uncomfortable statement. No one wants to hear this. We live in an era where happiness has become synonymous with being successful, achieving goals, fulfilling dreams, gaining recognition. But what almost no one says is, being successful can also destroy you. The paradox is cruel. The search for an ideal life leads many to conquer everything and yet feel that they have nothing. The problem is in the premise. We start from the assumption that happiness is a state to be reached, as if there were an emotional plateau where after conquering certain external conditions, the mind finally rests. That is the modern myth, the myth of arrival. But the mind does not rest. The mind, as Pascal wrote, is the greatest of all runaways. Even when the body rests, it searches. It searches for what is missing. What could be better? What could be more? This dynamic is ancient, but it was never as cultivated as it is now. Sociologist Zygmunt Bauman called this liquid modernity, an era where everything is transient and where human identity is built on what one is not yet. That is, our peace depends on what is still missing. That is why success, far from solving the problem, often enlarges it. It delivers what desire wanted, only to reveal that it was not enough. The promised happiness arrives and disappoints, and since there's nowhere else to run, the collapse comes. Nietzsche wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how, but when the why is false, the how becomes unbearable. Many live guided by a false why. They work tirelessly for a future version of themselves, sold by slogans, influencers, and unattainable models. But the price of that effort is alienation from the present. It is living like someone crossing a desert with their eyes fixed on the horizon and, therefore, never realizing that there was an oasis under their feet. This is the most respected vice of our time, the vice of searching. And, like all vices, it demands increasingly larger doses. Today, you have to achieve goals. Tomorrow, you have to surpass your previous version. In the end, you become a performance machine, empty inside. South Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han describes this precisely. The excess of positivity, performance, stimulation, all this, does not free us. It makes us sick. And here is the central point. Happiness, when sought as a final product, transforms into a tyranny because it imposes an emotional obligation to be happy all the time. And since this is impossible, every moment of tiredness, sadness, or anguish becomes proof of personal failure. There is no more sophisticated prison than one that seems comfortable. And success, often, is that padded cell. The person has everything, but cannot say they are unhappy. After all, what right would they have to complain? So, they fall silent. And in that silence, unhappiness grows. The lesson here is simple. Life cannot bear to be transformed into a happiness project. Because happiness, contrary to what is sold, is not something to be pursued. It is the residue of a life that has meaning. And meaning is not sought. Meaning is built. Fundamentally, all this modern logic starts from a childish idea that life has an obligation to make us happy. But perhaps the adult, the true adult, is the one who understands that life is not about being happy. It is about being whole. And wholeness, sometimes, requires accepting anguish. Accepting that there is no final state. Accepting that everything passes, including what you call success. This is the final blow against any illusion. If your happiness depends on something you can lose, it is not real. It is just a shadow, fragile, volatile, conditional. and living for shadows is an elegant way of imprisoning oneself. Perhaps that is why so many winners are silent. Because deep down, after the medal, after the applause, after the conquest, they discover that the cage is still there. They just exchanged iron for platinum. We search for meaning incessantly. But the more we search, the more the world seems to return silence to us. This is the contradiction that underlies much of human anguish, the desire to find something solid in a universe that does not respond. We want a voice that says, "Go this way, everything is fine." But life, relentless and indifferent, simply keeps happening, without a script, without a manual, without promises. What do we do in the face of this? We try to fill the silence with religion, with status, with work, with distraction, but none of that lasts. None of it holds up. And then we go back to feeling, even surrounded by achievements, that something is missing. The paradox of our condition is this: life only makes sense if we stop trying to force it. And this is not an invitation to nihilism, it is a call to presence. Observe a cat. It is not searching for anything, it is not an existential crisis, nor trying to prove its worth. It simply is, and because of that, it inhabits a type of freedom that we have forgotten how to access. That freedom is that of disinterested attention, the state in which something is done not because it will bring reward, but because it is the end in itself. It is when you watch the rain just to watch. You walk without a destination. You sit down without touching your phone. You are not producing anything, but you are living everything. This is the practical lesson that the Stoics already taught. Epictetus wrote, "Do not seek that events should happen as you wish, but wish that events should happen as they do, and you will be happy." This sentence, at first glance, seems passive, but it is an active call to the real. It says, happiness is not in control, it is in presence. Modern life pushes us in the opposite direction. We live in the logic of performance. Even leisure has become a project. We meditate to be more productive, we read to perform better, we travel to show off, we have unlearned how to do something without a motive, and that is where we disconnect from the simplest and, paradoxically, most powerful experience of existence. Being alive just for being alive. The mental state where we are totally immersed in the present, not because we want something, but because we dissolve into it, like the cat in front of the window, like the child playing alone. Like you, perhaps, when you forget for a moment that you have to get somewhere. The crisis is not in lacking meaning. It is in not knowing how to stop. Stop to see that perhaps meaning is not found, it is revealed. And it is revealed in the minimal things. Daily, silent, in a hot coffee, in a sincere hug, in a minute where nothing is expected. And exactly because of that, everything feels right. The cat did not philosophize about time, but it lived time without trying to dominate it. It did not seek happiness, but it was happy in the act of watching the world go by. This is the secret we forgot. Happiness does not scream, it does not impose itself, it appears, almost shyly, when you finally stop looking for it, and instead, you simply sit at the window and observe. It is possible to be unhappy because we are trying to be happy, not from lack of effort, but from the excess of it, not from absence of method, but from the obsession with control. This is the paradox that confuses and frustrates millions of people every day. The more we focus on happiness as a goal, the more it slips away through the edges of experience. It flees when it becomes the focus. It disappears when it becomes an obligation. And however counterintuitive this sounds, science confirms it. Researchers at the University of Denver discovered that people who overvalue happiness, those who say, for example, being happy is the most important thing in life, end up presenting higher levels of loneliness, anxiety, and depressive symptoms. The reason? The unrealistic expectation creates constant frustration. Happiness becomes a performance goal, and when the internal state does not correspond to what it should be, the feeling of failure sets in. But it's not just psychology. Philosophy always knew it. Lao Tzu, over 2,000 years ago, already warned, "He who searches does not find. He who surrenders receives." This is the key: surrender. Not as resignation, but as openness. As someone who stops trying to manipulate their own experience and finally begins to inhabit it. This logic is also behind the concept of flow, which we discussed recently, described by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. That is, the peak of happiness occurs when you are not even thinking about being happy. That is why certain experiences mark us so much. A conversation where time disappears, a creative work that consumes our attention, a moment where there are no goals or judgments, only presence. And the most curious thing is that this cannot be forced. Trying to enter flow already breaks the flow. Trying to be spontaneous already makes the gesture artificial. Happiness, in this sense, is like sleep. The harder you try to sleep, the less you succeed. And here we return to the root of the modern problem, the idea that happiness is something that must be produced. We transform the inner life into an assembly line. But happiness is not manufactured, not measured, not controlled, not systematized. It emerges, and it only emerges in fertile ground. Ground where desire is not on fire, where the self is not constantly at the center, where the world can be seen with less ambition and more acceptance. Nietzsche called this Amor, Fati, the love of fate. Not enduring what happens to us, but wishing for exactly what happens. It is one of the most difficult ideas to live by, and one of the most liberating, because only when we accept the real as it is imperfect, chaotic, incomplete, can we move within it without the chronic frustration of wanting it to be something else. The paradox is this: the more you try to guarantee happiness, the further it moves away. But when you finally stop, not out of fatigue but out of lucidity, it appears at the edge, gently, as someone who wants nothing, as someone who was never the end, but only a side effect of being truly alive. You never needed to search. That is the verdict, the inevitable revelation after all. After Tantalus and his eternal hunger, after the golden cage of success, after the absurd silence of life, after the paradox of detachment, everything points to the same truth. Happiness is not achieved, it happens. And it happens precisely when the self stops demanding, when desire quiets down, when the world is accepted as it is, and not as your anxiety would like it to be. This is not conformism, it is freedom. The rare freedom of someone who no longer feels indebted to themselves, who has stopped negotiating with destiny. Of someone who, instead of asking what is missing, learned to ask what is already here. The modern world taught us to run and promise that there would be peace at the end. But peace was never there. It was always here, in this exact instant that you learn to despise in the name of an ideal future. We have reached the point where even silence has become a product. But true silence, the one you feel by simply being, cannot be bought, followed, or performed. It only appears when you are no longer trying to be anyone, only when you sit like the cat in the window and want absolutely nothing. The philosopher Alan Watts summarized this precisely. The only way to make sense of change is to plunge into it, move with it, join the dance. That is the dance. Life does not demand that you dominate it, only that you accompany it. And happiness does not demand that you understand it, only that you stop smothering it with expectations. Now you know, the less you seek, the more you find. And what you find is not a promise, nor an answer, nor a manual. It is just life, finally alive, simple, uncontrollable, whole. If you have made it this far, perhaps you have already felt this firsthand, this silent restlessness, this emptiness that persists even after everything seems to be right. You are not alone. And perhaps, just perhaps, that is why this channel exists. To remind you that there is another way to look at life, more honest, cruder, more lucid. To all the members who are already part of this journey, you are the backbone of this project. It is thanks to your courage, to sustain this search for truth, without romanticism, that all of this remains alive. My deepest and most sincere gratitude. I'll see you in the next video.